All right, what is up, YouTube? We are about to go into a MTGO Modern Challenge event with black-white tokens. Um, it's a deck I've been playing intermittently for a long time, but last couple weeks I've been playing a little bit more. I have a lot of footage recorded that I'll probably go back and retroactively post, but for now I wanted to bring this Modern Challenge event because I've been tuning this list a little bit for what the metagame looks like right now. We're fresh off of GP Vegas, which showed slightly different metagame, but not really. Still a lot of Death Shadow, just didn't top 8. Still a lot of Eldrazi Tron, even though it didn't top 8. But those are the big decks that I've been playing against a lot on Moto. And so this deck's tuned to be able to match up against those decks. We'll talk about those matchups in a minute. But also Affinity, three people in the top 8, 3 lists in the top 8, which is great for a deck like Tokens because we tend to have a pretty favorable Affinity matchup. Just having a bunch of flying tokens that are often bigger than 1/1s is pretty tough for them to attack through, given they really depend on flyers and attacking through things. So with a good amount of disruption, we tend to have a pretty favorable matchup there. So hopefully those decks keep coming out, and some of the control decks have been coming out more blue-white control, Jeskai control, which is also a great matchup for a deck like this. Any Lingering Souls deck, really, just because they're 1-for-1 removal and counter spells are terrible against Lingering Souls. Their removal is terrible against any of our threats. And we just pack a ton of discard here, which is great against decks like that. So, yeah, let's get to the list and go through. So, some of the standard things, obviously the kind of package of Lingering Souls, Spectral Procession, and Bitter Blossom is pretty standard here. And then kind of creating a bunch of tokens, and then pumping those tokens up with Intangible Virtue and Sorin. Sorin, Solemn Visitors, pretty excellent here. The life gain is very, very relevant against a lot of decks, especially if we're, just with lands, even though we're a 2-color deck, we're still fetching and shocking occasionally. Mostly Thoughtseize, though. I like to play a lot of Thoughtseize, and also the life loss from Bitter Blossom does add up, so being able to gain a lot of that back with Sorin's pretty huge. And Intangible Virtue is just incredible in a deck like this. Having flying tokens, turning those into Vigilance actual threats is huge. Flying and Vigilance is, in any format of Magic, is just really, really good because it's just free attacks, and not having to choose whether you need to hold your creatures back to block and stay alive versus try to pressure the opponent is just backbreaking against a lot of different decks to be able to do both. So it's a pretty big deal here, and also really just doubling your power, right? Making Spectral Procession into 6 power versus 3 is huge, and Lingering Souls into 4 or 8 instead of 2 or 4 is pretty impressive. So Birch is a great card. You'll see me side it out. I do tend to do side. I just try to shave one often because it is the only card here that doesn't really do anything on its own. And so against a lot of the grindy, attrition-y type matchups, you don't want too many cards that don't do anything on their own. Because if you have no tokens out, this card is just stone blank. And given, we don't have a ton of token producers threats, we only have 12, and we'll get to that. I guess if you count Sorin, it's a little bit more. But when it's good, or when you have any tokens at all, it's amazing. Even just, it really turns 2 tokens into a threat. Which is, even just, grinding out, and then you just happen to have the back half of Lingering Souls in your graveyard with a Virtue. Just having 2/2/2 flying Vigilance tokens is really, really strong. Souls, I play 5 if I could, or 6 even. Procession can be pretty clunky. which is why I'm only running 3. I shave down to 2 sometimes, and if I made some changes in this deck, that might be something I shave down again. It's incredibly strong card, right? Especially with a pump effect out. Putting out 3 flying tokens at once is crazy, but I tend to find that 3 is not too much more than 2, and having this card just be blanked completely by a sweeper is pretty tough, whereas things like Lingering Souls and Bitter Blossom, your tokens they're resilient even to things like Pyroclasm and Anger of the Gods and all that stuff. So these tend to be pretty strong in that sense. And the Bitter Blossoms, just having too many is tough. Usually against the decks that it's good, 1 is enough. 2 can be fine, it just speeds up your clock, but it's not necessary. And a lot of times just the life loss of having 2 Bitter Blossoms out is a little too much to overcome quickly. So that's why I only run 3 of those. Then the new spice I've been liking a lot is the new Almond Kit cards, start to finish. This deck, as you kind of see, is split pretty evenly between threats and interaction. You know, if you kind of, look here, we got 17 and 17 here, right? This is all interaction basically, and then all our threats over there. And having to choose is pretty tough. So having a card that gives both is, I found to be very, very useful. And neither half of the card is particularly strong by modern standards, right? It's just a overcosted Raise the Alarm, even though the creatures do have vigilance, which is relevant, you know, in case you don't have a virtue out. And then the back half is just a sorcery speed murder, which is also not great, or a bone splinters, I guess you could say, technically. But again, in a deck like this, sacrificing a token is fairly irrelevant. It's mostly free, especially if Bitter Blossom out or Procession and Souls and everything. It's mostly free. But being able to do both is really worth it, right? Because you're kind of overpaying. You know, Raise the Alarm is a card that Black-White Tokens has played periodically. The instant speed ends up being very relevant against decks that are running sweepers or even just messing with your opponent's math. You know, if you've got 2 Lingering Souls tokens out and a Tangible Virtue, they know they're taking damage every turn, but they're banking on 4, and being able to turn that 4 damage into 8 damage at instant speed at the end of their turn is really changes their game plan, especially in a highly interactive format like Modern. And then, you know, to overpay Raise the Alarm by 1, and then for a free card get a Bone Splinters, is really, really good, especially right now in the current format of just a lot of big creatures. Eldrazi Tron, this is great against, just to have another removal spell that's not costing you a card. Grixis Death Shadow, obviously this kills all of their threats, and very effectively too, right? They only play about, you know, 8 big creatures plus 4 Snapcaster Mages, with Snapcasters are fairly irrelevant as attackers or blockers here in this matchup. But their big creatures are, so being able to kill those is great. And then also just not having to play a Hero's Downfall or a Murder or Fatal Push that is dead against most of your control opponents or your creatureless opponents, and at least being able to turn your removal spell into a Raise the Alarm is pretty huge. So I've liked this card a lot. Obviously you can't really run 4 because it's pretty clunky, but just having this versatility is very valuable, and I could see this being adopted in a lot of decks in the future. It's hard, you know, it's a great value card for even like an Abzan deck or something like that. The reason it is actually effective here is that both sides, like I said, both sides are useful, because Finish is useful in any deck, and 2 1/1s is not useful in a lot of decks unless they have flying, like Lingering Souls. But because we're running Virtues and Sorens, you know, the front half of this card is a real card in this deck, and that's why it works here. So we'll see if it ends up playing in other decks or not, but certainly in this one, I'm a huge advocate for it. It does remind me a lot of another relatively new card, to Modern at least, is Collective Brutality, which has solidified itself as a Modern staple already. Um, and if you look at Brutality, it doesn't do anything particularly efficiently, right? It's an overcosted Duress that's worse. It's an overcosted Disfigure that's sorcery speed. And then the third mode is useful, but never a card that someone would play if that's all it did. Certainly not in the kind of decks that's playing Brutality. So the reason it's so good is just versatility, right? To be able to do any of those things with one card is huge. You know, to be able to duress your control opponents while disfiguring your elves or affinity opponent is huge, and not having to choose. And that's why this card is very good. And also just the fact that you can do multiple of these things, right? You are able to do both or all three if you need to. It's not exactly card advantage because you're having to discard cards, but it is turning sometimes otherwise dead cards into real spells. So I kind of find the start to finish similar in that it does two different things that you want, neither very efficiently, but place a high premium in Modern on the versatility of being able to do both. So that's my soapbox for this card. Hopefully you guys will be able to watch it play out as well as it's played out for me. So again, Brutality is a card that I love running in this deck, especially being able to discard souls is great. Sometimes you just, you know, if you're playing against a quick opponent or a burn deck, you want to discard a Bitter Blossom, which is too slow and causing you life loss. You know, rather gain 2 life than to play out Bitter Blossom. That's not going to give you any value for 2 or 3 turns, and even then it's going to cost you some life. Being able to discard start to finish, right? And just have finish in your graveyard, and then kill the creature that you need on turn 3 instead of having to play start on turn 3 and then finish on turn 4. And then even just being able to discard dead removal spells or dead discard spells if you need to. Blessed Alliance has what used to be a sideboard card for me, but again, this card is just so good against Eldrazi Tron and Death Shadow that it's worked its way up to 2 main deck copies in here. It is a situation removal spell, so it's not good against a lot of decks. But against the biggest decks of the format, and with some of the most problematic cards, right? Reality Smasher is a really problematic card against this deck because we chump block very well, but we don't block trample very well, and having to discard cards when we try to path it or finish it is pretty tough. So having something like Blessed Alliance is pretty huge. And the life gain is really relevant too. I mean, like we talked about with Bitter Blossoms and Thoughtseizes and lands, this deck does take a good amount of damage and is pretty slow to get started. So this deck does tend to get behind by turn, until turn 3 or 4 where we're able to establish some of our board presence. So having the life gain is huge, and obviously there's the making the opponent, because this target player gains life, so making your Death Shadow opponent gain life, and if they're at 10 or 11 and have a Death Shadow or 2 out, making them gain 4 life will kill their Death Shadows, which is a fun little trick, but it doesn't come out quite that often. The good Death Shadow players are aware of this card more and more, which is where Snapcaster Mage is good, because they'll just attack their Snapcaster Mage in just to protect their Death Shadow or Tassiger from this card. But it is important to remember that you can always, if they're attacking with 1 or 2 small creatures and then their big creature, you can block their small creatures, trade with those, either let the big one hit you or just chump block the big one, and then end of combat step while their creature is still technically an attacking creature, and the other attacking creatures have died off, you can then cast it after combat, before their second main phase, and it'll work out that way. So just tricks to remember. But anyway, the versatility here is a big part, as you're seeing with a lot of these cards. Just this is a very, very mid-range deck, and versatile threats or versatile cards are huge. And then of course the queen herself, Lily, is just a great card in any kind of mid-rangey grindy black deck, and that's what this is. I'm gonna go up to 3 very, very soon because she ends up being great. The problem is she fits in the mid-range game plan, but costing 3 is pretty tough when we're trying to play souls and processions on 3. So as you see, all of our interaction here costs 1 and 2 mana, which is pretty important because you're trying to interact with the opponent early and then play threats late, or later in the game, you know, it's important to be able to like cast Lingering Souls on 3 and then on turn 4, either Virtue plus Thoughtseize or Virtue plus Leave Up Path or something like that. Or obviously if you have 4 lands, you can do a couple different things, you know, Brutality and Virtue, but costing 3 is tough because this is where we want to be starting to play our threats. And there aren't, other than Bitter Blossoms, not a lot of good 2 mana threats because Virtue doesn't do anything on turn 2. So that said, when she against the deck she's good, she is just phenomenal. She can win games on her own, which is hugely important, and really has added something that this deck was missing. Even just more removal spells is great against things like decks like Boggles, having main deck answers to that, and not having to worry about playing sideboard cards for something like Boggles, which is pops up online frequently enough that it's annoying, but not enough that you want to dedicate sideboard slots for it. So having 4 main deck answers for a deck like that is pretty nice. In addition to removal spells, of course. So she's great. I'll probably go up to 3. She's one where I'm thinking I might go up to a 3rd one and shave a Spectral Procession. We'll have to see how the threat base goes there. The other option is shaving a Sorin, but there are enough aggressive decks that the life gain here is pretty huge. So, but that is to come later. And then the standard removal and discard suite. 7 discard spells. Again, this deck tends to get the ball rolling later in the game, so being able to take early threats is more important. We don't want to Thoughtseize ourselves too much when we have Bitter Blossom. We don't want to lose too much life. And then Path to Exile is just the best removal spell in the format, really. Can't beat it. I've definitely tried playing some Fatal Pushes. I'm sure it's a question that'll come up. Any black deck that wants removal is try out Fatal Push. I ended up wanting the sideboard, but I was main decking more. I was doing 3 path, 3 push, but I find that this deck doesn't do very poorly against small creatures that Fatal Push is important for. Obviously, Tarmogoyf and Death Shadow are great hits, but I have, you know, Path to Exile, Death Shadow is still plenty good. Blessed Alliance on it is pretty good, and Finish is good. And against the small creatures, I just have a lot of blockers. I have some collective brutalities, which are end up being the way to kill small creatures in the early game. And I find that the bigger problems for this deck are cards that Fatal Push doesn't hit. You know, things like, well, Tassiger is a problem just because it draws cards. But things like Reality Smasher and Thought Not Seer and Endbringer and the other Eldrazi, the Reach Eldrazi that forgetting the name, the green one, the 5/7 that kills a land and everything. So being able to path things like that, and Wormcoil Engine is a big problem too. Being able to path Wormcoil Engine and the Green Titan, sometimes Red Titan when that comes up. So I just feel like Fatal Push doesn't kill enough of the problem cards against this deck. And our early interaction is going to come more from things like playing some early tokens than it is from worrying about Fatal Pushing their creatures. So I just went back to 4 path. And it is not irrelevant to path one of my own tokens to try to ramp up. So this can be a very useful ramp spell. It's great against Blood Moon, because I can path a token and go get a basic land. We'll get to the mana base in a second here, but as you see, not a ton of basics or fetch land, so that all becomes very relevant. So that's the main deck here. As far as lands go, Concealed Courtyard's great early. It's tough that it doesn't let you play Sorin on time, but or your Spectral Possession on 4 if you need to. But other than that, it's been great. Marsh Flats, of course. Shambling Vent is great. I have cut down to 3. Which has been tough because this deck is a long game deck, so the vents are relevant, but I needed to go up in our fetch land base. So we got 4 Marsh Flats, Flooded Strand, Polluted Delta, 6 fetch lands, 4 basics. It's hard to run non-plains lands for Spectral Procession, but this deck is fine just playing this for 4 mana a lot. It's not a huge deal. It's more important to be able to play your discard spells or play Liliana on 3. so I need more. I need more swamps, and 4 basics is, you just need to remember to get them. This deck isn't that, you know, it's 2 color, so you can afford to fetch for basics a lot and not have to worry about shocking yourself. Obviously, still run a couple Goblet Shrines so that Floated Strands can get black and Polluted Delta can get white, and just so I can fetch out both if I need both. But you don't want to shock yourself too much because you don't, try not to deal yourself that much damage. And being 2 colors, you can afford to just fetch up basics and save yourself some life. Also, because we're 2 colors, we can run the full forward main deck Ghost Quarters, which is great against many decks. It is very useful to have here. And we do have some expensive cards that don't require colored mana, like Sorens and Processions and Souls and Start to Finish and whatnot, so it doesn't end up hurting you that much. And then 1 Vault of the Archangel, which also is very good at what it does. And in a deck like this, even if you're activating just to gain 2 to 6 life is awesome, but being able to give your chump block tokens Death Touch really puts a stop sign on your opponent, especially with something like a Tangible Virtue against like Eldrazi decks or Death Shadow decks, or you know, even any green-black X rock decks. Being able to attack with your tokens every turn and then leaving Vault open on their turn really halts their attacks, because they don't, you have a bunch of Death Touch threats that they don't want to attack into. In the meantime, you're clocking them in the air, so that's huge. Alright, so our sideboard here, like I said, is geared at kind of the standard black-white sideboard cards. We have 3 Stony Silence, which I've gone up to 3, not for affinity so much. It's obviously good against Lantern as well, but I haven't seen a lot of Lantern lately. But Lantern is very problematic for us, so having this is great. But also Eldrazi Tron. It is pretty good against regular Tron if you can get it early and shut off their maps and whatnot. And obviously they're Oblivion Stones, but for Eldrazi Tron's been playing, you know, plays more Mind Stones and doesn't shut down Chalice, but Walking Ballista and Hangerback Walker are pretty dead to this card, especially Walking Ballista. It's just a really bad Grey Ogre type card against this, so it's very useful. And Walking Ballistas, as you can imagine, when you're playing a bunch of tokens, can be pretty problematic, so this is mostly for their deck here. Rest in Peace. Again, the only thing it does is shut off our souls and our Start to Finish, but if I'm bringing this in, it's because it hoses the opponent a lot more than us. Dredge is a very problematic matchup, so I'd like to run more of these, but again, Dredge isn't that popular, and it's a pretty bad matchup anyway, so I don't want to have a lot of sideboard cards for a deck that, you know, even if I bring in 4 Rest in Peace, I'm still an underdog in. I'd rather spend more sideboard slots to help the matchups that can actually be helped. But I also do have Surgical Extraction for that, and against their Dredge, if you can just take out their Prized Amalgam, most of their other creatures are 1/1s and 2/1s and 1/2s and smaller things. It's the 3/3s that are tough, so I can actually kind of try to play a fair fight and try to race them a little bit better with Sorens and Intangible Virtues if they don't have the Prized Amalgams. So being able to hit, that's huge. And then Surgical is just so good against any combo deck. Being able to take their combo pieces is hugely important, and we are a pretty interactive deck. We're not trying to beat them, you know, kill them by turn 4 before the combo deck can get there. So Surgical is pretty good, and being free is awesome. Being able to tap out for your threats and still leave open some interaction is pretty incredible here. Auriok Champion's great against Burn. It's great against Death Shadow. It's great against Dredge. So it is a pretty relevant card. I've gone up to 3 as much before. I used to play some in the main deck, but obviously I've had to shave it for these cards and Start to Finish and whatnot. But I love Auriok Champion. I think it's a very good card, especially in a deck like this. Like I said, if this really is the game breaker against Burn, if you can land this early, it really shuts them down. That or a Sorin that actually gets to hit, or a Sorin plus that actually gets to hit with your tokens. One Fatal Push, just Misers against any creature deck that I would like. You know, against Elves and Merfolk and Affinity and all those decks, you want to have more early removal. And again, it's great against Death Shadow as well, and Tarmogoyfs and Grim Flayers and whatnot. So good to have, but it's kind of just a Misers in case I want it. Liliana the Last Hope is also been, again, excellent against Affinity and Elves and the Abzan Company decks, pinging their mana elves. And then I even bring it up in a lot of control matchups because we have so much interaction in this deck that is kind of dead in a lot of the control matchups. Just having another threat is huge. And even though she's not doing anything while she's on the board, it's really just a clock, right? It's just a uptick, uptick, uptick. Even if you're not upticking on anything, it's a threat they have to deal with before you get to the ultimate, because most decks just can't deal with this ultimate. And especially like your blue-white decks really have a hard time dealing with Planeswalkers. So I have liked her a good amount. Not sure if it's worth it over, you know, if it wasn't for, otherwise I'd probably put her another Fatal Push, and I think against the decks I want Fatal Push, she just does a repeatable effect that's very similar. Then again, we got Damnation against some creature decks. Great against Eldrazi Tron, which is why I've gone up. Great against Abzan Company decks. Great against Elves, Merfolk Affinity, etc. So a lot of the popular decks this is very good against. And again, given that so many of my token makers are recurable threats, Damnation's pretty good for us. Anguish Unmaking, just to deal with any problematic, you know, we don't have any other way of dealing with enchantments or Blood Moon, for example, or you know, the Blue-Red God, for example, from Theros block, and other than discard spells. So just to kind of catch all, I again used to run one of these main deck, but it is pretty bad a lot of the time, unless you really have to kill something specific. So I've moved it over to the sideboard. And it's good against Tron too. Again, Karn and Ugin are Karn's not a huge deal. Karn's, obviously it's a great card and is very problematic, but Ugin is just backbreaking for this deck. This deck can never beat a Resolve Ugin. So having an answer in addition to Thoughtseize is pretty good. And then I tried main decking Basilisk Scholar for a while, and I did like it a lot. I moved to the sideboard just to bring in more Brutalities and Blessed Alliances, because those cards are good against similar decks as the Basilisk Scholar. But again, more life gain is good, and then just like we talked about with Vault, being able to have ways to deal with your opponent's big creatures is huge. So the Death Touch ends up being pretty excellent. And even with this, even if you're just gaining 1 to 2 life a turn, sometimes against a deck like Burn or Affinity, just a little bit of life gain sometimes is enough to buy you an extra turn or two, and then you get to attack 1 or 2 more times with Intangible Virtue up and win the game. So even if it's mediocre life gain, it's still great. And then it's also good against Eldrazi, Tron, or any Eldrazi decks, any creature deck really, Tarmogoyfs and whatnot. So it's been a decent card in a lot of relevant matchups. So there it is. It was pretty long, but hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and hope you guys enjoy the games.